When Elijah Morgan pulled the half-frozen woman from the deadly blizzard, the name she uttered made his blood run colder than the storm haze. The daughter of the man who had destroyed his life 15 years ago and sent his brother to die in prison. The hammer in his hand suddenly felt heavy with 15 years of suppressed rage, but as their eyes met in the flickering forge light, Elijah made the split-second decision that would forever alter both their destinies. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The blizzard had come without warning, sweeping across the mountain valley with a vengeance that made even the oldest settlers tremble. Elijah Morgan worked the bellows with practiced movements, his weathered hands never faltering despite the cold that crept through every crack in his workshop walls. The forge glowed hot and angry, a defiant heart of fire against the howling white death outside. Sparks danced upward with each strike of his hammer, briefly illuminating the array of tools hanging on the walls, his life's work displayed like trophies in this remote corner of Colorado territory. Wind rattled the small window, and Elijah paused, watching as ice crystals formed intricate patterns across the glass. February in these mountains was unforgiving in the best of times. This storm, though this was something different, something hungry. He had stoked the forge higher than usual today, less for the work and more to keep death at bay. The worn wooden beams above groaned under the weight of accumulated snow, and he made a mental note to clear the roof come morning, if morning decided to arrive at all. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound he nearly mistook for the wind, a weak knocking at his door. Elijah frowned, setting down his hammer carefully on the anvil's edge. Visitors were rare enough in fair weather. In a blizzard like this, they were unheard of. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Hold your horses," he muttered, wiping soot-stained hands on his leather apron before crossing the workshop floor. He unlatched the heavy wooden door, and the wind immediately tried to tear it from his grasp. Snow swirled in, bringing with it a figure so covered in white it might have been a ghost. "Please," came a voice, definitely feminine and undeniably desperate. "Please help me." Without hesitation, Elijah pulled her inside and forced the door shut against the howling gale. The woman, for it was indeed a woman, stumbled forward, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. He caught her by the elbow, steadying her as she trembled violently. A leather satchel hung across her body, clutched protectively even in her distress. "Good God, miss. What in Avon's name are you doing out in this?" He guided her toward the forge where the heat was strongest, could have frozen to death. She didn't answer immediately, her gloved hands shaking too badly to unfasten the ice-crusted scarf covering most of her face. Elijah hesitated only briefly before helping her, revealing features that struck him with unexpected force-hide cheekbones. A straight nose now red with cold, and eyes the color of a summer storm. Young, perhaps 25, with brown hair falling in half-frozen tendrils from beneath her snow-caked bonnet. "My stagecoach," she managed through chattering teeth, "overturned ... 2 miles back. The driver." "I don't know if ... single quotes easy now," Elijah interrupted, removing her sodden cloak and hanging it near the forge. "You're here, and you're alive. That's what matters at the moment." He retrieved a rough wool blanket from his small adjoining quarters and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her dress was too fine for these parts, though now soaked through at the hem, the kind city women wore, with too many buttons and not enough practical warmth. "I saw your smoke," she continued, color slowly returning to her lips. "Followed it. I thought I wouldn't ... The snow was so deep." Elijah nodded, saying nothing as he moved to a small pot he kept near the forge. He poured hot water from it into a chipped cup, adding dried herbs that filled the air with a sharp medicinal scent. "Drink this," he ordered, pressing the cup into her still trembling hand. "It'll warm your insides." She obeyed without question, wincing at the bitter taste but drinking deeply nonetheless. For several minutes the only sounds were the crackling of the forge fire, the relentless wail of the wind, and the woman's gradually steadying breaths. "I'm Elijah Morgan," he finally said, turning back to his anvil, uncomfortable with idleness even in such unusual circumstances. "This is my forge. You're welcome to shelter here until the storm passes." "Catherine," she replied, her voice stronger now. "Catherine Hayes. I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Morgan." The name sent a jolt through Elijah's body, his hammer freezing mid-swing. He set it down carefully, his back still to her as his mind raced. "Hayes? It couldn't be. Not here, not after all these years." "Hayes," he repeated, his voice deliberately neutral as he turned to face her. "Any relation to Jeremiah Hayes of Boston?" The woman's Catherine's eyes widened slightly. "My father. You know him?" Elijah's jaw tightened beneath his graying beard. "We've had ... dealings." Catherine Hayes, daughter of Jeremiah Hayes, the man who had destroyed everything Elijah had once held dear. The reason he now lived alone in this mountain wilderness, hammering iron instead of practicing law. Fate had a cruel sense of humor, delivering his enemy's flesh and blood right to his doorstep. "I see," Catherine said cautiously, clearly sensing the sudden tension but too exhausted to fully comprehend it. It's a small world, I suppose. Smaller than you might think. Elijah turned back to his work, bringing the hammer down with controlled force. Each strike echoed his racing thoughts. After 15 years, the past had found him, wearing the face of this woman who had no idea who he truly was, or what her father had done. Catherine watched him work for a few moments before her gaze drifted to the workshop. Despite her exhaustion, curiosity flickered across her. Swords crossed on the far wall caught her eye, not the crude weapons of frontiers, but the elegant instruments of formal dueling, relics of a life Elijah had left behind. "You're more than a blacksmith," she observed quietly. Elijah didn't pause in his rhythmic hammering. "I'm exactly what you see, Miss Hayes. Man who shapes metal in the wilderness. My father would say there's always more to a man than what meets the eye." "Your father," Elijah replied, unable to keep a slight edge from his voice, "has been known to be wrong about many things." Catherine frowned slightly, but seemed too weary to pursue the matter. She pulled the document from her satchel instead, checking that it remained undamaged. The official seal of the Colorado Territorial Court was visible even from where Elijah stood, the golden emblem catching the forge light. "Important papers?" he asked, despite himself. "A deed," she answered, carefully returning it to her satchel. "My father's company is expanding westward. I'm to deliver this to his representative in Silver Creek." Of course, Jeremiah Hayes, ever the empire builder, now spreading his tentacles even to this remote territory. Elijah's knuckles whitened around his hammer handle. "Silver Creek is still 30 miles west," he said, "and this storm won't let up for at least 2 days." Catherine's shoulders slumped slightly. "I had hoped to arrive by tomorrow." "Nobody arrives anywhere in a blizzard like this, Miss Hayes. Not alive, at least." She nodded reluctantly, exhaustion finally overwhelming her as she swayed on her feet. Elijah moved quickly, catching her arm once more. "You need rest," he said gruffly. "There's a cot in the back room. It's not much, but it's warm. I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition, it's survival." His tone left no room for argument. "I'll sleep by the forge. I've done it many times before." Catherine hesitated, then nodded gratefully. "Just until morning, then. If the weather clears, it won't." Elijah interrupted with the certainty of a man who had lived with these mountains long enough to read their moods. "But we'll speak of that tomorrow." He led her to the small adjoining room that served as his living quarters, a simple space with a narrow cot, a rough wooden table, and shelves lined with books that seemed oddly out of place in a blacksmith's dwelling. Catherine noted them with surprise, but was too exhausted to comment. "Rest," Elijah said, closing the door behind her. Alone again, he stared into the forge flames, memories rising unbidden like ghosts. Jeremiah Hayes, after all this time, the man who had bribed judges, manipulated testimony, and destroyed Elijah's legal career in Boston with fabricated charges of evidence tampering. The man whose machinations had sent Elijah's younger brother to prison, where he had died waiting for an appeal that never came. And now Hayes's daughter slept in his home. Unknowing, innocent, Elijah gripped the edge of the anvil, his knuckles white. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, trapping them together in this small fortress of stone and timber. Perfect opportunity for the revenge he had abandoned hope of ever taking. Yet something held him back, perhaps the last remnants of the principled man he had once been, or simply the knowledge that Catherine Hayes was not her father. She had come to him seeking shelter, and whatever else he had become in his exile. He was not the kind of man who would punish a daughter for her father's sins. Still, as he added wood to the forge and watched the sparks rise, Elijah couldn't help wondering if the storm had brought him more than just an unexpected guest. Perhaps after 15 years it had finally delivered a reckoning. Catherine woke to unfamiliar surrounding, momentarily disoriented by the rough-hewn beams above her head and the distant rhythmic clanging of metal on metal. Memory returned in fragments, a stagecoach overturning. The desperate trek through knee-deep snow. Finding the blacksmith's forge. Mr. Morgan. The intensity in his eyes when she'd mentioned her father's name. She sat up slowly, her muscles protesting after yesterday's ordeal. Through the small window, she could see the storm still raged undiminished, great swirls of white obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The mountain howled like a living thing. Catherine's gaze fell on a steaming cup beside the cot, along with a folded piece of fabric. A note in a strong, slanted hand lay beneath. Tea, and clothes more suited to the cold. E.M. The offered garments were simple but sturdy, a woolen shirt, thick trousers clearly meant for a smaller man than her host, and knitted socks that looked handmade but well worn. Not at all appropriate for a lady, but practical given the circumstances. Catherine hesitated only briefly before changing. Her own dress, even after drying near the forge, remained damp at the hems and far too restrictive. When she emerged from the small room, Elijah Morgan didn't look up from his work. His hammer rose and fell with metronomic precision, shaping a piece of glowing metal into what appeared to be a horseshoe. Sweat glistened on his forearms, despite the cold air that leaked through the workshop's seams. "The clothes fit well enough," she said, feeling oddly self-conscious. "Thank you." Elijah glanced up then, his expression unreadable as he took in her transformed appearance. "They belonged to my apprentice before he left for California." "You have a generous heart, Mr. Morgan." A short, humorless laugh escaped him. "No one has accused me of that in a very long time." Catherine moved closer to the forge's warmth, watching as he worked. His hands were fascinating, powerful yet precise. capable of both brute force and delicate manipulation. They were not the hands of a simple blacksmith, she thought again. There was an educated grace to his movements that belied his frontier appearance. You still haven't told me how you know my father, she ventured after several minutes of silence. Elijah plunged the horseshoe into a barrel of water, which hissed and steamed in protest. No, I haven't. He hung the finished piece on a hook with others of its kind, then wiped his hands on a rag. Are you hungry? The abrupt change of subject was deliberate, but Catherine nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow feeling in her stomach. Yes, actually. Without further conversation, he moved to a pot hanging near the edge of the forge and ladled what proved to be a surprisingly flavorful stew to 2 wooden bowls. They ate in silence at his small workbench, the storm providing a constant background symphony. I've upset you somehow, Catherine finally said, setting down her spoon. If it's about my father, it's not a discussion for today, Elijah interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. You're my guest, however unexpected. There'll be time enough for old grievances when the snow stops falling. Catherine studied him across the bench. In daylight, such as it was through the storm-darkened windows, she could better see the man who had saved her life. Elijah Morgan was older than she'd first thought, perhaps mid-40s. With threads of silver in his dark beard and at his temples. Deep lines etched the corners of his eyes, whether from squinting at hot metal or from harder experiences, she couldn't tell. His features might once have belonged in a Boston drawing room rather than this remote mountain ford. Were you always a blacksmith? She asked. Something flickered in his eyes, caution, perhaps remembrance. We all become what circumstances make us, Miss Hayes. Catherine, she corrected. If I'm to impose on your hospitality for days, we might as well dispense with formalities. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Catherine, then, and you haven't answered my question. Elijah rose, collecting their empty bowls. No, I haven't always been a blacksmith. Once I was a lawyer in Boston, but that was many years and many miles ago. A lawyer in Boston, her father's world. The connection couldn't be coincidence, and Catherine's curiosity deepened. Before she could press further, however, Elijah abruptly changed course. Your document, he nodded toward her satchel, which hung on a peg near the door. A deed, you said. What sort of expansion brings Jeremiah Hayes to a place like Silver? Catherine hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal given his obvious animosity toward her father. But there seemed little harm in sharing what would soon be public knowledge. The railroad is coming through, she explained. My father's company has acquired land rights along the proposed route. Silver Creek sits at a critical junction. Elijah's expression darkened. Of course. The great connectors of East and West and convenient instruments for men like your father to extend their reach. The railroad brings progress, Mr. Morgan. Communities like Silver Creek will benefit from progress, he interrupted, the word sharp as a blade. Is that what they're calling it now? I've seen Jeremiah Hayes' version of progress. It leaves little standing in its wake except what he himself owns. Catherine straightened, a flash of defensive anger rising. You speak as though you know him intimately, yet you refuse to explain how. If you have some quarrel with my father, I'd prefer you state it plainly rather than making veiled accusations. Elijah regarded her silently for a long moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, controlled. 15 years ago, I was defending a case against your father's company miners who'd been cheated out of their claims through legal manipulation. I had evidence. Witnesses. The night before the final hearing, that evidence disappeared from my office. The next morning, I was accused of attempting to fabricate testimony. Catherine's breath caught. The Blackwell case, she whispered, the pieces suddenly connecting. You're Elijah Morgan, the disgraced attorney who fled Boston rather than face disbarment. The very same, he acknowledged with a bitter smile, though disgraced implies I was guilty of what they claimed. My father said you tried to bribe witnesses, that you destroyed evidence that would have exonerated his company. Sure he did. Elijah turned away, adding wood to the forge fire. And I'm equally sure you believed him. Daughters usually do. Catherine fell silent, her mind racing. She had been only 10 when the scandal broke, too young to understand the details, but old enough to hear her father speak of the corrupt lawyer who had nearly smeared the Hayes' family name. Now that lawyer stood before her, telling a very different version of events. My brother was one of those miners, Elijah continued quietly, his back still turned. After I was ... discredit continued to fight. Your father's men caught him trying to access company records. He was charged with breaking and entering, sentenced to 5 years. He died in prison of pneumonia after just 2. The grief in his voice was raw, even after 15 years. Catherine found herself without words, the certainty of her father's integrity suddenly less absolute. I'm sorry about your brother, she finally managed. Elijah faced her again, his expression once more composed. Thomas was 26. He left a wife and infant daughter. I don't know what became of them after ... After I left, the implications hung heavy between them. Elijah Morgan hadn't merely relocated. He had reinvented himself entirely, abandoning his profession, his name probably changed, hiding away in this remote wilderness where Boston scandals couldn't reach. Why tell me this now? Catherine asked. Because that storm won't let up for days, he answered simply, and I have no desire to spend them pretending we're merely strangers thrown together by circumstance. Catherine nodded slowly, understanding. The blizzard had forced them into an intimacy neither would have chosen, captor and captive, victim and perpetrator's daughter, all roles thrust upon on them by the unforgiving weather. "What now then?" she asked. Elijah turned back to his forge, lifting his hammer. "Now I continue my work, and you decide whether you believe your father's version of history or consider that there might be another." The hammer fell, sending sparks flying upward. Catherine watched him work, the document in her satchel suddenly feeling heavier with implications she hadn't considered when she'd agreed to deliver it. Outside, the blizzard intensified as though determined to keep them confined with these uncomfortable truths until some resolution reached. She had come west as her father's trusted emissary. Now, trapped with his alleged victim, Catherine found herself in the unexpected position of judge, with only the storm's duration to determine where the real truth lay. By late afternoon, the workshop had fallen into a strange rhythm. Elijah worked methodically at his forge, occasionally disappearing outside to clear snow from the path to his small stable where Catherine learned he kept 2 horses and For her part, Catherine explored the confines of her temporary prison, finding unexpected treasures that only deepened the mystery of her reluctant host. The bookshelves in his living quarters held volumes she would never have expected in a mountain. Blacksmith's Home, Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, Milton's Paradise Lost, several works by Shakespeare, and dozens of legal texts, their spines cracked and pages dog-eared from frequent use. A man holding onto the remnants of his former life, she thought, or perhaps unable to fully leave it behind. "You still practice law, in your way," she observed when Elijah returned from one of his excursions, snow melting from his beard as he hung his heavy coat by the door. He followed her gaze to the bookshelves and shrugged. "Old habits. The mind needs exercise as much as the body, especially in winter isolation. Do the people here know about your background? They know I can read and write better than most. Sometimes they bring contracts for me to review, disputes for me to settle." A faint smile touched his lips. "They pay in chickens and moonshine more often than coin." Catherine tried to imagine her father's reaction to such an arrangement. Jeremiah Hayes didn't get out of bed for less than $100. "Why here?" she asked suddenly. "Of all places to disappear, why choose this wilderness?" Elijah was silent for a long moment, stoking the forge fire. "After Thomas died, I had nowhere to go. Your father's influence made sure no law firm in Boston would touch me. I traveled west, took odd jobs. In St. Louis, I apprenticed myself to a blacksmith, a German who didn't care about Boston scandals. He tested the fire's heat, seemingly satisfied. When he died 3 years later, I kept moving west. These mountains, ... single quotes, he gestured vaguely toward the snow-obscured window. There's an honesty here. The elements don't care who you were. They only care if you're strong enough to survive them now." Catherine watched him work, noting the careful precision in his movements. "And your family? Did you leave anyone behind? No wife? No children?" "My parents were already gone. Thomas was all I had." He glanced at her. "And you? Does someone wait for your return besides Jeremiah Hayes?" "My mother passed when I was 12. There was a suitor briefly, but she stopped, unsure why she was sharing such personal details with this man. No one waits." Elijah nodded as though confirming something to himself. "Then we are both alone in the world." The simple statement hung between them, oddly intimate. Catherine looked away first, moving to the small window where frost patterns had formed intricate designs along the edges of the glass. Outside, the world had disappeared into whiteness, a blank canvas obliterating all landmarks. "Will they search for me, do you think, when I don't arrive in Silver Creek?" "Not in this," Elijah replied. "No one risks the high passes during a blizzard, not even for Jeremiah Hayes' daughter. They'll wait until it clears, then send riders." He paused. "That deed you carry, it must be important for your father to send you personally." Catherine's hand drifted to her satchel, which she had kept close despite the apparent security of their shelter. "It's the final piece. Without it, the entire land acquisition falls apart, and the matter was too sensitive to trust to regular posts. There have been ... complications. Another company has shown interest in the same. My father believed a family representative would ensure the documents arrived without interference." Elijah's expression hardened. "Clayton Pacific." Catherine looked up, startled. "You know of them? I make it my business to know who buys up land in these parts." He set his tools down, giving her his full attention. "Clayton Pacific has been acquiring parcels along the eastern approach for months. Their surveyors mapped the pass last summer. Then you understand why this deed is so critical. If my father secures Silver Creek, he controls the western access point," Elijah finished, forcing Clayton either to negotiate with him or abandon their investment entirely. He laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Same tactics, different decade." Catherine bristled. "It's business, Mr. Morgan. My father identified the opportunity first, did he?" Elijah's eyes held hers. "Or did he simply have the resources to move more quickly once Clayton's surveyors did the difficult work of identifying the route?" Before Catherine could respond, a deep rumbling sound interrupted them. Not the wind, but something more primal. The entire workshop trembled, tools rattling against the walls. "Avalanche," Elijah said grimly, already moving toward the door. "The north face, by the sound of it." Catherine followed him to the threshold. He opened it cautiously, and bitter cold rushed in along with the sight of a massive wall of snow cascading down the mountainside perhaps half a mile away. Even from this distance, the power of it was terrifying. Trees snapping like twigs, boulders tumbling like children's marbles. "The stable," Catherine gasped, remembering his earlier trips. "Will it? It should be sheltered by the ridge," Elijah said, but concern etched his features. "Stay here." Before she could protest, he had plunged into the storm, a rope tied around his waist and anchored to a heavy iron ring beside the door. Catherine watched his form grow fainter as he battled through the deep snow, heading toward where she presumed the stable must be. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. The avalanche's roar faded, but Elijah did not return. The rope remained taut, stretching into the whiteness. Worry gnawed at her, not just for the animals, but for this man who had shown her kindness despite every reason not to. Making a sudden decision, Catherine grabbed his spare coat from its peg and wrapped it around herself. It enveloped her completely, the hem dragging in the snow as she followed the rope into the storm. The wind clawed at her, trying to push her back, but she pressed forward, one hand gripping the rope like a lifeline. She found him halfway between the forge and the stable, struggling with something beneath the snow. As she drew closer, she realized it was a section of the stable roof, partially collapsed and pinning something beneath it. "Well, what are you doing?" he shouted when he saw her, his voice nearly lost in the wind. She called back, dropping to her knees beside him. "What's trapped?" "Artemis, my mare." The weight of the snow collapsed part of the roof. He was digging frantically, his hands already red and raw from the cold. "The beam has her pinned." Without hesitation, Catherine began digging as well, clearing snow while Elijah worked to lift the fallen beam. Together they created enough space for the frightened horse to struggle free, her dark eyes rolling in panic. "Easy, girl," Elijah soothed, somehow managing to calm the animal despite the chaos around them. He turned to Catherine. "The others are still inside. The structure is compromised. We need to get them all to the forge." Working together, they managed to lead all three animals through the blinding snow back to the relative safety of the workshop. It was barely large enough to accommodate them, but Elijah quickly rearranged his space, creating a makeshift stable in one corner. Only when the animals were settled did Catherine realize how cold she'd become, her borrowed clothes soaked through and her fingers numb. Elijah noticed immediately, guiding her to sit on a stool near the forge. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said, his tone gentler than his words as he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "I couldn't just wait," Catherine replied through chattering teeth, "not knowing if you were in danger." Something shifted in Elijah's expression, surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. "Why would you risk yourself for me? I'm nothing to you." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "You saved my life yesterday. That makes you something." He held her gaze for a long moment before turning away, busying himself with stoking the fire higher. "You need dry clothes again, and something hot to drink." As he moved about the workshop, Catherine watched him with new eyes. This man, her father's sworn enemy, had shown more genuine concern for her welfare than most of the polished gentlemen in Boston's finest drawing rooms. It was becoming harder to reconcile the bitter blacksmith with the villain of her father's stories. The avalanche had changed something between them, a shift as subtle but significant as the trembling earth that had preceded the snowslide. They had worked together, trusted each other's actions without question. Now, as the day faded toward another long night of storm-enforced intimacy, Catherine found herself wondering what other truths might lie buried beneath the surface of their strained, forced companionship. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a treacherous question formed. What if her father had been wrong about Elijah Morgan all along? Night fell with a finality that seemed to seal them off from the outside world entirely. With the horses settled in their improvised shelter blankets hung to separate them from the workshop proper, Elijah and Catherine sat at his small table, a lantern casting long shadows across their faces. Between them lay a chessboard carved from pine, the pieces obviously handmade but crafted with remarkable skill. "Your work?" Catherine asked, moving a pawn forward. Elijah nodded. "Winter evenings are long up here. A man needs occupation besides drinking or he'll lose his mind." Catherine studied the board, noting how the knights had been carved to resemble mountain lions rather than traditional horses. "You play with yourself?" A rare smile touched Elijah's lips. "Occasionally. Though I find I'm either a poor winner or a sore loser depending on which side I'm favoring." Catherine laughed, the sound startling in the quiet workshop. It felt strange to find any levity in their situation, yet here it was a moment of genuine amusement shared with the man who had every reason to hate her. "I never asked," she said as he contemplated his move, "how you recognize my name so quickly. Hayes is not uncommon." Elijah's fingers hovered over a bishop. "I've followed your father's business dealings over the years. Old habits. When Clayton Pacific began surveying, I suspected Hayes Enterprises wouldn't be far behind." He moved his piece. "Check." Catherine frowned at the board, then at him. "You've been anticipating this land battle. I've been watching it unfold for months. Silver Creek sits at the gateway to the richest silver deposits in the territory. The railroad makes it accessible. Whoever controls the junction controls the future of mining in this region. And you care because I've seen what happens to places like this when men like your father arrive with their contracts and surveyors." Elijah leaned back, his expression hardening. "The independent miners get pushed out. The small operations can't compete. Eventually, even the land itself is reshaped to suit Eastern investors who've never set foot on the soil they're tearing apart." Catherine moved her queen, blocking his check. "Progress has costs, Morgan. but it also brings benefits: employment, infrastructure, civilization. Is that what they teach at those finishing schools in Boston? Elijah countered, his voice not unkind despite the challenge in his words. That it's acceptable to destroy existing communities for the sake of civilization? Catherine bristled. My education was considerably more substantial than dancing and watercolors. I assure you, I don't doubt it, he replied, studying the board. Jeremiah Hayes wouldn't raise a daughter incapable of understanding business. He'd want an ally, perhaps even an heir. The observation was uncomfortably perceptible. Her father had indeed insisted on tutoring her in finance and business law from an early age, to the scandal of Boston society. You speak as though you know him intimately. I spent 2 years investigating his methods before the Blackwell case. I interviewed dozens of people he'd dealt with. Partners, rivals, employees. Elijah moved his knife. Check again. Catherine studied the board, seeing no immediate escape. And what conclusion did you reach from this investigation? That Jeremiah Hayes believes absolutely in his right to succeed, and considers any obstacle merely a problem requiring elimination. Elijah's eyes met hers across the table, no matter the human cost. Something in his gaze made her look away. You make him sound like a monster, not a monster. A man who has convinced himself that his vision of progress justifies any action. Elijah's voice softened slightly. The most dangerous men are those who believe themselves righteous while committing atrocities. Catherine abandoned the chess game, rising to pace the small room. These are serious accusations. You speak of my father as though he's a criminal, yet he's never been convicted of any wrongdoing. Men like your father are rarely convicted, Elijah replied, remaining seated. They own too many judges. And I'm simply to take your word on this? Catherine turned to face him, anger flaring. The word of a man who has lived in exile for 15 years, nursing his grievances? Elijah stood then, moving to a chest in the corner of the room. From it he withdrew a leather portfolio, worn and cracked with age. Not my word alone. He placed the portfolio on the table, opening it carefully. Inside were documents, dozens of them, meticulously organized. Letters, affidavits, newspaper clippings, all relating to Hayes Enterprises and its various dealings across the northeastern states. What is this? Catherine asked, though she already suspected the answer. Evidence, Elijah replied simply. What I managed to salvage before leaving Boston. Copies of the documents that disappeared from my office that night. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the papers. The topmost was a sworn statement from a miner named Jacob Blackwell, detailing how Hayes Enterprises had altered boundary markers on his claim after a promising silver strike, then used the confusion to file their own overlapping claim. Others told similar stories, small operators forced out through legal manipulation, dubious safety violations suddenly discovered after owners refused buyout offers, witnesses who changed testimony after unexplained financial windfalls. These could be forgeries, she said, but without conviction. The pattern was too consistent, the details too specific. Some are original documents, others are copies I made anticipating that something might happen to the original. Elijah watched her face as she read. Your father's men were thorough when they broke into my office, but not thorough enough. Catherine sank back into her chair, the weight of what she was reading settling over her. If all this is true, it is, then why didn't you fight? Take it to another court, another judge. Elijah laughed bitterly. With what resources? My reputation was destroyed overnight. No reputable attorney would touch the case. And after Thomas died, ... single quotes, he shook his head. By then I wanted nothing more than to disappear. Catherine continued reading, unable to stop despite the growing horror in her chest. One particular document caught her eye. A letter from a Judge William Harrington to her father, dated 3 days before Elijah's evidence vanished. Asterisk Jeremiah, asterisk, asterisk, the Morgan situation requires immediate attention. His evidence in the Blackwell matter is compelling, particularly the survey maps showing the original claim boundaries. If these reach open court, not even I can ensure the desired outcome. I strongly recommend alternative measures before Monday's hearing. Asterisk, asterisk, your devoted friend. Asterisk, asterisk, William asterisk. Catherine recognized the name. Judge Harrington had been a frequent dinner guest in her father's home, a man she'd been taught to address as Uncle William. This letter, ... single quotes, she whispered, holding it up, found its way to me after Harrington died 6 years ago, Elijah explained. His clerk had kept it, along with other potentially damaging correspondence. Apparently, the good judge had a crisis of conscience in his final days. Catherine read through several more documents before carefully closing the portfolio. Her hands were steady now, but her mind was in turmoil. Everything she had believed about her father's integrity, his business acumen, his oft-stated commitment to fair dealing was being systematically dismantled by the evidence before her. Why show me this? She asked finally. Elijah considered her question before answering. Because you deserve to know what you're carrying in that satchel. What purpose it truly serves. The deed is legally obtained, Catherine insisted, though uncertainty now colored her words. I don't doubt its legal status. Your father would be too clever to forge documents. But I question how the previous owner was persuaded to sell. and whether they understood the land's true value. Catherine thought of the elderly widow her father had mentioned, a woman apparently, eager to unload worthless mountain property to finance her relocation to St. Louis. Had she known about the railroad plans? About the silver deposits Elijah mentioned? "I need air," she said suddenly, rising from the table. Elijah gestured toward the door. "The storm won't allow much of that." Indeed, when Catherine cracked the door open, the wind nearly tore it from her grasp. Snow immediately began to pile at the threshold, driven by gale-force winds. The cold that rushed in seemed alive, hungry. She closed it quickly, leaning her forehead against the rough wood. "What am I supposed to do with this information?" she asked without turning around. "You've spent 15 years collecting evidence against my father. Am I expected to suddenly denounce him based on one night's reading?" She heard Elijah move behind her, though he kept his distance. "I don't expect anything from you, Catherine. What you do with the truth is your decision." She turned to face him then, finding his expression not triumphant, as she might have expected, but solemn and perhaps even sympathetic. "Why didn't you ever try to publish these findings? Send them to newspapers? And be dismissed as a disgruntled failure seeking revenge?" Elijah shook his head. "Your father's reputation would have survived. Mine was already destroyed." Catherine looked back at the portfolio on the table, then to the satchel containing the deed, the final piece in her father's carefully constructed plan for Silver Creek. Outside, the blizzard howled like a living thing, as though the very elements were responding to the turmoil within her. "Dawn will come eventually," Elijah said quietly, "and with it, choices." Catherine nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. When the storm cleared, she would have to decide whether to continue to Silver Creek as her father's loyal emissary or to become something else entirely. Neither of them slept much that night. Catherine lay on the cot, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, her mind racing between memories of her childhood and the damning documents she had read. Every tender recollection of her father, teaching her to ride, comforting her after her mother's death, proudly introducing her to his business associates as the future of Hayes Enterprises, now cast shadows of doubt. Had it all been a performance? Was she merely another asset to be deployed, like the deed in her satchel? In the main workshop, separated by a thin wall that did little to muffle sound, Elijah moved restlessly. She heard him stoke the forge several times, the rhythmic scrape of his tools suggesting he worked through his insomnia rather than courting it in stillness as she did. When dawn finally arrived, it came as a subtle lightening of the gloom rather than the triumphant burst of sunshine Catherine had hoped for. The storm had weakened somewhat, but still shrouded the mountains in swirling white. She emerged from the small room to find Elijah bent over his anvil, hammering what appeared to be a delicate filigree pattern into a small piece of metal. Not horseshoes or practical tools this time, but something that required artistic precision. He looked up as she approached, dark circles beneath his eyes matching her own. "You craft beautiful things as well," Catherine observed, gesturing toward his work. Elijah set down his hammer. "Beauty has its place, even in utility." He lifted the piece, a decorative clasp of some kind she now saw, for Mrs. Thornton's music box. Her husband commissioned it for their anniversary. "They trust you with such delicate work." A hint of pride crossed his features. "I may be the only blacksmith for 20 miles, but I earned my reputation through craftsmanship, not monopoly." The subtle jab at her father's business methods wasn't lost on Catherine, but she let it pass. "Have you eaten?" He gestured toward a pot of coffee and a plate of biscuits on the small table. "Help yourself." They shared a simple breakfast, the silence between them less tense than before, but weighted with unspoken thoughts. Through the window, the storm continued its assault, though with diminished fury. "It's breaking," Elijah noted, following her gaze. "By tomorrow, perhaps the day after, the paths will be passable." Catherine nodded, surprised to find herself not entirely relieved by the prospect. "The stagecoach driver, do you think he survived? If he was experienced in mountain travel, he would have stayed with the coach rather than trying to walk out. A search party will find him once the weather clears." "I should have stayed as well," Catherine mused. "It was foolish to attempt the journey on foot. You'd likely be dead if you had," Elijah said matter-of-factly. "Overturned coaches offer poor shelter in blizzard." The bluntness of his assessment startled her. In Boston, men took pains to shield ladies from unpleasant realities, particularly those involving mortality. Elijah Morgan, it seemed, had no interest in such pretenses. "Why Silver Creek?" he asked suddenly. "Of all the tasks your father might have entrusted to you, why this particular errand?" Catherine hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal, but after what he had shown her last night, concealment seemed pointless. "It was a test, my first significant assignment for the company, and if you succeeded, a more formal role in Hayes Enterprises. My father has no sons, and I've shown aptitude for the business." She looked down at her coffee. "I've spent years trying to prove myself worthy of his trust." Elijah studied her with unexpected compassion. "And now you wonder if that trust is worth having, wouldn't you? In my position?" She met his gaze directly. "Everything I thought I knew about my father has been called into question by a stranger in the wilderness. A man who, by his own admission, has every reason to seek vengeance against my family. Is that what you think this is? Vengeance? What else should I call it?" "You've kept a dossier on my father for 15 years. Elijah set down his cup carefully. "Not vengeance. Justice. There's a difference. A fine distinction when the result is the same. My father's reputation destroyed. Your father destroyed my life, Catherine. He sent my brother to prison where he died. He took everything from me. For the first time since her arrival, real anger surfaced in Elijah's voice. Yet here you sit, unharmed, fed, and sheltered in my home. If vengeance were my goal, would I have extended such courtesies to Jeremiah Hayes' daughter? The truth of this struck Catherine forcefully. Elijah had every opportunity to turn her away that first night, to let the blizzard claim her. Instead, he had taken her in, knowing exactly who she was. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That was unfair of me. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Your skepticism is natural. You barely know me. I'm beginning to, she replied, surprising herself with the admission. A log shifted in the forge, sending sparks floating upward. Elijah rose to attend to it, seemingly grateful for the distraction. As he worked, Catherine found herself studying him with new awareness, the precise economy of his movements, quiet competence in his hands, the way the firelight caught the silver threads in his hair. This man who had once argued before Boston's highest courts now shaped metal in isolation. His considerable intellect focused on creating practical beauty in a harsh land. Do the people here know, she asked, about your history with my father? Elijah arranged the burning logs with an iron poker before answering. They know I came from the east, that I was once a lawyer. The specifics of why I left, no. He turned to face her. Few in these mountains care about a man's past, only his present usefulness. That must be liberating. It has its moments. He gestured toward the window. The storm's lightning. We should clear the roof before the weight becomes dangerous. Catherine recognized the deliberate change of subject, but didn't press. Instead, she rose and reached for the borrowed coat. I'll help. Elijah looked as though he might protest, then reconsidered. Very well. Outside, the world had transformed. Though snow still fell, it came now in fat, lazy flakes rather than the stinging horizontal assault of the previous days. Massive drifts had formed against the workshop walls, reaching nearly to the eaves in places. The stable, partially collapsed from the avalanche, stood as a stark reminder of the storm's destructive power. Quote, working together, they cleared the heavy snow from the workshop roof using long-handled wooden scrapers. The physical labor was unfamiliar to Catherine, but she matched Elijah's pace as best she could, finding unexpected satisfaction in the methodical work. When they finished, both were breathing hard, clouds of vapor forming with each exhalation in the bitter cold. Look, Elijah said suddenly, pointing eastward. Catherine turned and gasped softly. The clouds had parted briefly, allowing a shaft of sunlight to pierce through, illuminating the snow-covered valley below in brilliant white. The beauty was almost painful in its intensity, pristine and untouched. Is this what you see every day? She asked, momentarily forgetting the cold in her aching arms. Not quite like this, he admitted. The aftermath of storms brings its own special clarity. Something in his tone made her look at him. His face was turned toward the light, and for an instant she glimpsed the man he might have been had life taken a different turn, younger, unburdened by bitterness, capable of appreciating beauty without qualification. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, clouds closing once more over the brief window of sunlight. But something had shifted between them yet again. Another layer of formality peeled away by shared labor and a moment of unexpected wonder. I've been thinking about your evidence, Catherine said as they returned to the workshop, stomping snow from their boots. If even half of what you showed me is legitimate, it is, Elijah interjected. Then others should see it, not just me. Elijah hung his coat beside the door. To what end? The statute of limitations has long expired on most of those. Your father's too powerful, too insulated by wealth and connections. Justice, you said. Isn't that worth pursuing? A bitter smile touched his lips. I pursued justice once. Cost me everything. Catherine removed her own coat, watching him move about the workshop with practiced ease. Perhaps you pursued it alone when you should have had allies. Elijah paused, turning to face her fully. What are you suggesting? I don't know yet, admitted. But the deed I carry, it's the linchpin of my father's entire Silver Creek strategy. Without it, Clayton Pacific would gain the advantage, and you would betray your father's trust, become complicit in undermining his plans? Elijah's expression was incredulous. Why would you consider such a thing? Catherine's hand went to her satchel, feeling the outline of the document within. Because if what you've shown me is true, then I've been complicit already in perpetuating harm I didn't understand. She met his gaze steadily. I was raised to believe in honesty and fair dealing. If my father has violated those principles, don't I have an obligation to right those wrongs? Elijah studied her for a long moment, searching for something in her face. You would risk everything, your relationship with your father, your future in his company, perhaps even your inheritance, for strangers like the Blackwells? Not for strangers, Catherine said quietly. For justice. Isn't that what you once did? The question hung between them, unanswered but not dismissed. Outside, the storm continued its gradual retreat, each passing hour bringing them closer to the moment when decisions could no longer be postponed. That evening brought a rare stillness as the storm temporarily abated, leaving the world outside muffled in deep snow. After a simple dinner of salt pork and beans, Elijah surprised Catherine by producing a dusty bottle from beneath a loose floorboard near the ford. "Apple brandy," he explained, holding it to the light. "From back east, I save it for special occasion." "And what occasion are we celebrating?" Catherine asked as he poured a small measure into 2 tin cups. "Survival, perhaps, or the luxury of difficult choices." He handed her a cup, their fingers brushing briefly. "Sometimes both are worth acknowledging." Catherine accepted the drink, savoring the warm, spiced flavor that brought memories of autumn in Massachusetts, a life that suddenly seemed very distant. "You have an unexpected way with words for a man who lives in near-complete isolation." "Words were once my profession," Elijah reminded her, settling into the chair opposite, "though hammers have largely replaced them." "Do you miss it? The courtroom, the intellectual challenge?" Elijah considered the question, swirling the amber liquid in his cup. "Parts of it. The pursuit of truth through argument. The satisfaction of a well-constructed defense." He took a small sip. "But I don't miss the politics, the compromises, the knowledge that justice often depended more on connections than facts." "Is that why you became a lawyer initially, to pursue truth?" "I became a lawyer because I believed in the system, in the idea that laws could protect the weak from the powerful if properly applied." His voice took on a distant quality, as though recalling a memory from another lifetime. "My father was a cobbler, worked his fingers raw making shoes for Boston's elite. When he died, the outstanding debts of his wealthy clients went unpaid, leaving my mother nearly destitute. No legal recourse." "I'm sorry," Catherine said softly. "Ancient history now," Elijah replied, though something in his eyes suggested the wound hadn't entirely healed. "But it shaped my path. I wanted to be the kind of lawyer who stood between the powerful and the powerless. Instead, I learned that the game was rigged from the start. Not all wealthy men are corrupt." Catherine felt compelled to argue, though her conviction had weakened considerably over the past 2 days. "No, but power without accountability inevitably corrupts." Elijah leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Your father isn't evil, Catherine. He's a man who stopped questioning his methods because the results benefited him, and no one with sufficient authority ever challenged him." The insight struck Catherine with unexpected force. Jeremiah Hayes had raised her to be strong-willed and independent-minded, to question everything except, she now realized, his own business practice. Those had always been presented as necessary, pragmatic, beyond reproach. "And now I must decide whether to be that challenge," she said, more to herself than to him. "It's not a decision to make lightly," Elijah cautioned. "Opposing Jeremiah Hayes has consequences. I'm living proof of that." Catherine studied him across the small table. This man whose life had been shattered by her father's machinations. Yet despite everything, he had built something here, a life of integrity and purpose, if not the one he had envisioned for himself. "Tell me about your brother," she said suddenly. Not how he died, but who he was. Surprise flickered across Elijah's features, quickly replaced by a softer expression she hadn't seen before. "Thomas was ... impulsive, brilliant, but restless. The kind of person who felt everything too deeply." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "He could charm birds from trees when he wanted to. Fell in love at least once a month as a teenager. You must have been very different, like night and day." "I was the careful one, the planner. He was all impulse and inspiration." Elijah's voice grew wistful. "He followed me into law because he believed in my causes, not because he had the temperament for it. Should have been an artist, really. He drew constantly, had a gift for capturing people's essence in a few strokes." Catherine tried to imagine this vibrant young man, so different from the brooding blacksmith before her, full of passion and promise before her father's actions had led to his imprisonment and death. The thought lodged like a stone in her chest. "Did he have children?" she asked, remembering what Elijah had said about a wife and infant. "A daughter, Sarah." Elijah set down his cup. She'd be about your age now. The realization hit Catherine like a physical blow. In another reality, this young woman might have grown up knowing her father, might have had opportunities that had been stolen from her by circumstances, by Jeremiah Hayes' decisions. "Have you ever tried to find her, or your brother's widow?" Elijah shook his head. "After I was disgraced, I thought it best to make a clean break. My presence in their lives would only have been a burden, a reminder of failure." His expression darkened. "And your father's men were watching them. I couldn't risk leading them to my new identity." Catherine drew in a sharp breath. "You'd think my father would have pursued them too?" "I know he would have. Jeremiah Hayes doesn't leave loose ends." Elijah rose and moved to the window, looking out at the moonlight now reflecting off the snow. "That's why this deed matter of yours concerns me. If it's as critical as you say, he won't simply accept its failure to arrive." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. If Catherine chose to defy her father, the consequences would extend far beyond a family rift. "What would you do?" she asked quietly. "If you were me?" Elijah turned from the window. "I can't answer that. The cost for you would be different than it was for me. But you'd want me to prevent him from taking Silver Creek." "What I want isn't relevant," he replied. "This has to be your decision, made with clear understanding of what's at stake for the people of Silver Creek, for your father's competitors, for your own conscience." Catherine appreciated his refusal to influence her directly, even as she found herself wishing for clearer guidance. "And if I choose to complete my mission, deliver the deed as planned, then I'll help you reach Silver Creek safely when the weather clears," Elijah said without hesitation. "And wish you well." The simple dignity of his response moved her unexpectedly. This man, who had every reason to manipulate or coerce her, was instead granting her complete autonomy over a decision that affected him deeply. And we would part as ... She left the question unfinished, unsure herself what word should complete it. As two people who briefly shared shelter from a storm, Elijah replied, though something in his expression suggested he found the prospect as unsatisfying as she did. Catherine rose, moving to stand beside him at the window. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars pricking the darkness like diamonds on black velvet. The snow-covered landscape glowed with an ethereal blue-white light, transforming the rugged terrain into something magical and otherworldly. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Yes," Elijah agreed, though when she glanced up, she found him looking not at the vista but at her. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken possibility. Catherine became acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from him in the otherwise chilly room. His eyes, which had seemed so hard when she first arrived, now held a depth of feeling that made her breath catch. Without conscious thought, she found herself leaning closer, drawn by something that transcended their complicated circumstances. Elijah remained perfectly still, his breathing shallow, as though afraid the slightest movement might shatter whatever was forming in the space between them. The spell broke when one of the horses nickered softly from the corner, startling them both. Catherine stepped back, her cheeks warming despite the cold air from the window. "I should rest," she said, her voice not quite steady. "If the weather holds, tomorrow may allow for decisions that can't be postponed." Elijah nodded, his own composure regained, though his eyes still held a warmth that hadn't been there days earlier. "Sleep well, Catherine." As she settled onto the cot in the small room, Catherine found her thoughts in disarray. The evidence against her father, the implications of the deed in her satchel, the growing connection with Elijah, all swirled together in a confusing tangle of loyalty, justice, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. Outside, the wind picked up again, sending fresh snowflakes dancing past the small window. The storm wasn't finished with them yet, she realized. Like the conflict within her, it had merely paused, gathering strength for what was to come. In the main workshop, she could hear Elijah moving about, his footsteps deliberate and measured. A man accustomed to patience, to waiting for the right moment. Perhaps that was what she needed now, not hasty decisions made in the emotional turbulence of revelation, but careful consideration of all that was at stake. Still, as sleep finally claimed her, Catherine couldn't help wondering if, like the brief moment by the window, some opportunities existed only fleetingly, vanishing if not seized when offered, and whether by morning she would have the courage to recognize which path represented true justice and which merely the comfortable illusion she had been raised to accept. Morning arrived with startling clarity. When Catherine woke, sunlight streamed through the small window, so bright against the snow that she had to shield her eyes. The storm had broken during the night, leaving behind a world transformed, pristine, dazzling, and suddenly accessible. She dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes that now felt almost natural and stepped into the main workshop to find it empty. The forge fire burned low and the horses watched her with placid interest from their corner. A note sat on the table in Elijah's now familiar handwriting, "Gone to check the pass. Back by noon." Alone for the first time since her arrival, Catherine found herself drawn to explore the workshop more thoroughly. She ran her fingers along the spines of his law books, noting the frequent markers and annotations visible along their edges. One volume of legal precedents fell open naturally to a heavily underlined section on property rights and eminent domain, a subject directly relevant to her father's railroad acquisitions. On the wall above Elijah's small desk hung a framed daguerreotype she hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a hanging tool. She carefully moved the tool aside to reveal a family portrait of younger Elijah, clean-shaven and formally dressed, standing beside a seated woman. Behind them, with a hand on Elijah's shoulder, stood a man who could only be Thomas, sharing the same strong jawline but with a more animated expression, a hint of mischief in his eyes despite the photograph's formal nature. A beautiful young woman sat beside Thomas, an infant cradled in her arms. His family, Catherine whispered to herself, feeling like an intruder in this private grief. She carefully returned the tool to its position, partially obscuring the image once more. Her exploration continued to a small chest beneath the workbench, its brass latch unlocked. Hesitating only briefly, justifying her curiosity as necessary to fully understand the man whose testimony threatened to upend her world, Catherine opened it. Inside lay carefully preserved mementos of a former life, law school diploma bearing the name Elijah James Morgan, a silver pocket watch inscribed to EJM from TWM Justice prevailed, several letters addressed to Uncle Elijah in a child's unsteady hand, and beneath them all a newspaper clipping yellowed with age. The headline made her breath catch. Hayes Mine Collapse Claims 12 Lives. Safety Violations Alleged. The accompanying article detailed a disaster at one of her father's earliest mining ventures in Pennsylvania. Witnesses claimed that support structures had been inadequate, that inspectors had been bribed, that warnings from workers had been ignored. The final paragraph noted that all legal claims against Hayes Enterprises had been settled out of court for undisclosed sums with no admission of wrong. The date on the article, July 15, 1859, was 2 months before Thomas Morgan's arrest. Catherine carefully returned everything to the chest, her hands trembling slightly. The connections were becoming clearer. Thomas hadn't simply been pursuing the Blackwell claim. He'd been investigating a pattern of negligence that had cost lives, perhaps the very evidence that had disappeared from Elijah's office before the hearing. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of boots stomping snow from the porch outside. Catherine quickly moved away from the chest as the door opened and Elijah entered, his breath visible in clouds as he stamped his feet and removed his heavy coat. "The main pass is still blocked," he announced, his cheeks ruddy from cold, "but the southern trail could be passable by tomorrow if the sun holds." Catherine nodded, trying to compose her features. "That's good news, I suppose." Elijah hung his coat and turned to face her fully, his gaze sharp. "You've been looking through my things." It wasn't a question. Catherine felt heat rise to her face but refused to look away. "Yes, I'm sorry for the intrusion, but given what's at stake, I have nothing to hide from you." Elijah interrupted, his tone surprisingly gentle. "Though I wonder what you found that's left you looking so shaken." "The mine collapse in Pennsylvania," she admitted. 12 men died." Elijah's expression darkened. 14, actually. 2 more died later from their injuries. He moved to the chest she had examined, opening it and removing the newspaper clipping. Thomas was originally investigating this incident. The Blackwell claim came later, connected by a common thread. "My father," Catherine said quietly, "and Judge Harrington, who buried the safety inspector's report." Elijah carefully refolded the clipping. "Those families received pennies for their loss, barely enough for funerals. Meanwhile, your father's company reported record profits that quarter." Catherine sank onto the bench, the weight of these revelations settling heavily on her shoulders. "Did my father know about the safety issues? The mine superintendent testified that he had personally informed Jeremiah Hayes of the danger 3 weeks before the collapse." Elijah's voice was clinical, devoid of emotion. "Your father deemed repairs too costly, with the coal seam nearly depleted. 14 lives against profit margins," Catherine whispered, feeling physically ill. "Now you understand why this isn't simply about a land dispute or my personal grievance." Elisha sat across from her. "Your father's business practices cost lives, Catherine, and if he gains control of Silver Creek, history suggests he'll operate with the same disregard for safety and fair dealing." The reality of what she was facing crashed down on Catherine with new clarity. This wasn't merely about choosing between family loyalty and abstract justice, it was about preventing potential harm to real people, miners and townspeople, whose lives would be directly affected by her decision. "The deed," she said after a long silence. "If I don't deliver it, Clayton Pacific would likely secure the junction," Elijah finished. "I make no claims about their moral superiority, but they lack your father's history in this region. At minimum, it would create competition, preventing a monopoly on access." Catherine looked up at him. "And if I were to do more than simply fail to deliver it? If I were to actively oppose my father's interests?" Elijah's expression remained carefully neutral, though something kindled in his eyes. "That would depend on what you had in mind. Your evidence, combined with my insider knowledge of current operations, would be compelling to the right of." Catherine felt a strange calm settling over her as the path forward clarified. "The territorial governor is known to be hostile to monopolistic practices. With sufficient proof of past wrongdoing, you would publicly stand against your own father?" Elijah asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "Not publicly, not yet." Catherine's mind was racing now, assembling pieces of a strategy. "But I could ensure your evidence reaches sympathetic officials, anonymously at first." Elijah studied her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're proposing becoming an informant against Hayes Enterprises while maintaining your position within it. That's dangerous, Catherine. No more dangerous than what you risked 15 years ago," she countered. "And I have advantages you didn't. I know how my father operates from the inside." "Your father isn't a forgiving man," Elijah warned. "If he discovered your involvement, then I would face the consequences," Catherine said firmly. "But I can't simply return to Boston and pretend I don't know what I now know. I can't be complicit." Something shifted in Elijah's expression. Pride, perhaps, or respect. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers briefly. "Your courage is remarkable." The touch sent warmth spiraling through Catherine's arm, a sensation entirely disproportionate to the simple contact. When he began to withdraw his hand, she turned hers upward, capturing his fingers with her own. "I wouldn't have found it without you," she said softly. The moment hung between them, charged with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. Then Elijah gently disengaged his hand, rising to stoke the forge fire with movements that seemed deliberately measured. "If you're serious about this course," he said without turning, "we need to be strategic. Your father will send people looking for you once the road's clear." Catherine nodded, though he couldn't see it. "I should continue to Silver Creek as planned, deliver the deed to maintain my cover, but ensure Clayton Pacific is aware of certain complications that might arise." "A dangerous game," Elijah observed, finally turning back to face her. "Playing both sides." "Not both sides. The side of truth." Catherine stood, moving toward him with newfound determination. "I'm not betraying my father, Elijah. I'm holding him accountable, something no one has managed to do in all these years." They stood facing each other beside the glowing forge, close enough that Catherine could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, could feel the heat radiating from the fire, and from something less tangible between them. "If I help you do this," Elijah said quietly, "there's no going back. Not for either of us." And Catherine held his gaze steadily. "But I believe this is the right path, the only path my conscience will allow." Elijah studied her for a long moment, as though memorizing her features. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his hand to her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Then we begin tomorrow," he said, his voice low. "When the southern trail clears," Catherine nodded, acutely aware of his touch, of the precipice on which they both stood, not just regarding her father's business dealings, but in the undeniable connection forming between them. Outside, the sun continued to blaze down on the snow-covered mountains, accelerating the melt that would soon make the paths passable. Time was running short for deliberation. Soon there would only be action and consequence. And somehow, in this remote forge high in the Colorado wilderness, Catherine Hayes had found both her greatest challenge and her most unexpected ally. The remainder of the day passed in careful preparation, while Catherine sorted through her belongings and repacked her satchel. Elijah spent hours in the stable, reinforcing the structure enough to retrieve his sled and harness. By evening, he had prepared his sturdest horse, a dappled gray gelding named Atlas, for the journey ahead. "You'll take the southern trail to Whispering Pine," Elijah explained over dinner, sketching a rough map on a scrap of paper. "It's a small trading post about 12 miles from there. The main road to Silver Creek should be passable. They keep it clear for supply wagon." Catherine studied the crude map, committing it to memory. "How long will the journey take?" "With good weather, 2 days." Elijah looked up from his sketch. "You should reach Silver Creek by nightfall the day after tomorrow." 2 days. The deadline her father had given her was still 5 days. Even with the delay caused by the storm, she would arrive with time to spare, maintaining the appearance of the dutiful daughter while harboring intention that would shatter that image forever. "What about you?" she asked. "After I leave?" Elijah's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'll continue as before. The people of Silver Creek don't connect me with Elijah Morgan of Boston. There's no reason they should suspect my involvement in whatever transpires. And yet you're risking everything to help me." "I risked everything 15 years ago and lost," he replied simply. "This time the risk seems more worthwhile." The way he looked at her as he spoke made Catherine's breath catch. There was something in his gaze that transcended their shared cause, something personal and undeniable that neither had fully acknowledged. "We need a way to communicate," she said, attempting to focus on practicality. "Letters would be too easily traced." Elijah considered this. "There's a half-Shoshone trapper named Jacob who travels between the settlements. He stops here every few weeks to trade. I've done legal work for him, land claims mostly. He's trustworthy and invisible to men like your father. Could he carry messages?" "Better than that," Elijah said, rising from the table. He retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf and placed it before her. Inside lay 2 identical silver medallions, each engraved with an intricate pattern of overlapping circles. "My work," he explained, lifting one by its leather cord. "Jacob carries these to trading posts throughout the territory. They're known as Morgan markers, proof that the bearer has my endorsement in matters of trade or dispute resolution." Catherine picked up the second medallion, admiring the craftsmanship. The silver caught the firelight, revealing subtle variations in the pattern that wouldn't be noticeable to casual observation. "If you need to send a message or signal danger, give this to Jacob or any mountain trader," Elijah continued. "Ask them to settle accounts with Morgan. They'll understand." "Beautiful," Catherine murmured, running her thumb over the intricate design. "It's also unique. Each one I make has subtle differences, a form of signature." He took the medallion from her hand and placed the cord around her neck. "Keep it hidden. In your world, it would simply be an unusual trinket. In mine, it carries meaning." The weight of the silver against her skin felt significant, like a pledge. Catherine tucked it beneath her borrowed shirt, where it rested cool against her breastbone. "What should I tell them in Silver Creek?" she asked. "About how I survived the storm. The truth, as far as it goes," Elijah advised. "Your stagecoach overturned. You found shelter with a mountain blacksmith. Weather delayed your journey. Nothing more need be said. In the deed, deliver it as planned. Maintain your father's trust." His expression grew serious. "But while you're there, listen. Learn who the key players are in Clayton Pacific. Find out who might be sympathetic to evidence of Hayes Enterprises' methods." Catherine nodded, the reality of her chosen path settling over her. "When I return to Boston, I'll have access to current contracts, correspondence documents that could corroborate your historical evidence. Be careful," Elijah warned. "Your father didn't become successful by being careless or trusting. He'll be watching, especially if complications arise with the Silver Creek acquisition." "I've been invisible to him in many ways," Catherine said with a hint of bitterness. "Being underestimated has its advantages." Elijah reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Don't underestimate yourself. What you're undertaking requires extraordinary courage." The simple touch sent warmth spreading through Catherine's entire body. They remained like that for a long moment, connected by more than just their shared purpose. When Elijah finally withdrew his hand, the absence felt palpable. "We should rest," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "Tomorrow comes early, and the trail will be challenging." Catherine nodded, though neither of them moved immediately. The awareness between them had grown too substantial to simply walk away from. Finally, she rose and gathered her few belongings, retreating to the small room that had become familiar over the past days. Sleep proved elusive despite her physical exhaustion. Catherine lay awake, listening to Elijah moving about in the main workshop, the occasional creak of floorboards betraying his own restlessness. Tomorrow she would leave this place, this man, embarking on a path that would forever alter her relationship with her father and her understanding of herself. She must have dozed eventually, for she woke to gray pre-dawn light filtering through the small window. Outside, fresh snow had fallen during the night, not a blizzard but a gentle dusting that softened the harsh landscape. Catherine dressed quickly in her own clothes, now clean and mended, though she kept Elijah's borrowed shirt as an extra layer against the cold. In the main workshop, Elijah had already stoked the forge to full heat. 2 cups of steaming coffee waited on the table, along with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Provisions, he explained, nodding toward the bundle. Enough for the journey to Silver Creek. Thank you. Catherine's voice sounded strange to her own ears, too formal, too distant for what had grown between them. Elijah checked the windows, then the door, movements that seemed designed to delay the inevitable. The sky's clear. We should leave within the hour to make best use of daylight. Catherine nodded, clutching her coffee cup as though it might anchor her to this place for a few moments longer. Elijah, A sound outside interrupted her. The unmistakable approach of horses through snow. Multiple riders by the sound of it. Elijah moved swiftly to the window, his body tensing at whatever he saw. 3 riders, he reported, voice low and urgent, coming up from the southern trail. Who? Catherine joined him at the window, peering out at the approaching figures. Not locals, Elijah said grimly. Too well-dressed. Citymen. As the riders drew closer, Catherine felt her blood run cold. She recognized the lead figure even at this distance. The distinctive bearing, the silver-trimmed hat. Henderson, she whispered. My father's head of security. Elijah's expression hardened. How would he know to look here? He wouldn't, unless Catherine's mind raced through possibility. The stage driver must have survived, reported the crash. They'd search all possible shelter points. They can't find you here, Elijah said decisively. It would raise too many questions. He moved quickly to the stable corner, gesturing for Catherine to follow. Behind a partition, a small door led to what appeared to be a storage room carved directly into the mountainside. My root cellar, Elijah explained, ushering her inside. Stay here until I come for you. Wait, Catherine caught his arm. What will you tell them? That I've seen no travelers, that the storm has kept me isolated. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. Catherine, if Henderson recognizes my name, he won't, she assured him. That part of my father's history isn't discussed. Henderson came later. Relief flickered briefly across Elijah's features. Outside, the riders were nearly at the door. Elijah, Catherine said urgently, suddenly aware that this might be their last moment alone. Whatever happens, she didn't finish the sentence with words. Instead, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. A kiss born of impulse and necessity, and something deeper that had been building since the moment he cut her down from that tree. For an instant, he remained motionless, surprised. Then his arms encircled her, pulling her closer as he returned the kiss with an intensity that left her breathless. When they broke apart, his eyes held hers with fierce determination. This isn't goodbye, he said softly. No, she agreed, the silver medallion warm against her skin beneath her clothes. It's a beginning. A sharp knock rattled the workshop door. With one last look, Elijah closed the root cellar entrance, leaving Catherine in cool darkness, the taste of him still on her lips as she listened to his footsteps cross the wooden floor to confront her father's men. From her hiding place in the root cellar, Catherine pressed her ear to the rough wooden door, straining to hear the conversation in the workshop. The space was cramped, but not uncomfortable. Shelves lined with preserved foods and root vegetables suggested Elijah was well prepared for mountain isolation. A thin shaft of light from a small vent hole provided just enough illumination to make out her surroundings. The workshop door creaked open, followed by heavy footsteps and Elijah's measured greeting. Morning, gentlemen. Unusual to see travelers so soon after a storm like that. We're searching for a passenger from the Silver Creek stagecoach, came a crisp, authoritative voice that Catherine immediately recognized as Henderson, a young woman. The coach overturned during the blizzard 3 days ago. Haven't seen any passengers, Elijah replied, his tone casual but guarded. Haven't seen much of anything except snow for nearly a week. There was movement inside the workshop booths on wooden planks, the rustle of heavy coats. Catherine imagined Henderson's shrewd eyes scanning the space, looking for signs of her presence. Had they left anything obvious? Her heart pounded so loudly she feared they might hear it through the door. The driver reported seeing smoke from this direction before they lost control, another voice said the young lady mentioned trying to reach it. My forge runs day and night in weather like this, Elijah responded. Keeps the cold at bay, but no one found their way here. A pause, then Henderson again. You live alone, Mr. Morgan. James Morgan. And yes, just me and the animals. Catherine held her breath at the partial truth. Would Henderson make the connection? But there was no reaction to suggest recognition. Mind if we look around? The young lady in question is carrying important documents. Her father is most anxious to ensure her safety. Her father? Elijah's voice revealed nothing. Jeremiah Hayes, Henderson said, the name falling like a stone in the quiet workshop. Perhaps you've heard of him. Hayes Enterprises. Can't say that I have. I don't follow much news from back east. Catherine could picture Elijah's impassive expression, betraying nothing of the bitter history that name evoked for him. Nevertheless, Mr. Hayes is offering a substantial reward for information leading to his daughter's safe return. If I'd found a half-frozen woman in that blizzard, I wouldn't need a reward to help her, Elijah replied, a hint of steel entering his voice. But as I said, No one's come this way. Footsteps moved around the workshop, Henderson conducting his inspection. Catherine's gaze darted to her satchel, which she'd brought into the root cellar. At least the deed was secure with her. What's through here? Henderson's voice came from alarmingly close to the root cellar door. Storage, Elijah answered, his tone still even. Root vegetables, preserves. Nothing of interest unless you're hungry. A tense moment passed. Catherine pressed herself against the far wall, barely breathing. Then, to her immense relief, the footsteps moved away. Your setup here is quite extensive for a solitary blacksmith, Henderson observed. Those law books, for instance. Unusual reading for a man of your profession. A man needs occupation during the long winters, Elijah replied, echoing what he'd told Catherine about the chess set. I do some informal arbitration for local disputes. The books help. Indeed. Henderson's tone suggested skepticism. And the woman's clothes drying by the forge? Catherine's heart sank. Her spare chemise. She'd washed it the previous day and hung it to dry. In their preparations and the surprise of the visitors, they'd forgotten to remove it. There was a brief silence before Elijah responded. Belonged to my sister. She passed last spring. I haven't had the heart to pack away her thing. The lie was smooth, delivered with just the right note of subdued grief. Catherine silently thanked Elijah for his quick thinking. My condolences, Henderson said, though his tone remained suspicious. Curious that you'd keep them near your work area. I keep her close however I can, Elijah replied simply. Another silence followed, broken only by the sound of boots moving across the floor and murmured conversation too low for Catherine to make out. Finally, Henderson spoke again. If you do encounter Miss Hayes, I'd appreciate you sending word immediately to Silver Creek. As I mentioned, her father is most concerned. I'll keep an eye out, Elijah promised. Though if she's been out in this weather for days without shelter, I'm afraid Mr. Hayes may be searching for a body rather than a living daughter. The blunt assessment made Catherine shiver, despite herself. Had Henderson not arrived, she would now be traveling through that same unforgiving wilderness. Let's hope not, Henderson replied, for everyone's sake. The implied threat wasn't lost on Catherine, nor, she suspected, on Elijah. More movement followed, the door opened and closed, and the sound of horses moving away gradually faded. Still, Catherine remained perfectly still, waiting for Elijah's signal that it was safe to emerge. Long minutes passed before the root cellar door finally opened, revealing Elijah's concerned face. They've gone, he said, offering his hand to help her out, but they'll be back. Henderson didn't believe me. Catherine stepped into the workshop, her legs stiff from crouching. You handled him perfectly. Thank you. He's searching the other outlying cabins, Elijah said, moving to the window to watch the retreating figures. But he's left one man on the ridge with a spyglass. They're watching the forge. Catherine joined him at the window, careful to stay out of sight. In the distance, she could make out a solitary figure on horseback, positioned with a clear view of Elijah's property. They know I'm alive, she realized aloud. The stagecoach driver must have seen me walking toward your smoke before they lost sight of each other. And now they've found a woman's garment drying by my forge, despite my denial of visitors. Elijah's expression was grim. Henderson will report this to your father. The forge will be watched, which means I can't leave without being seen, Catherine concluded. And if they see Jeremiah Hayes' daughter emerging from the home of the man whose life he destroyed, they'll know something is amiss, Elijah. Your father would immediately question your loyalty, especially once the deed is delivered. Catherine paced the small workshop. Mind raced. Then I don't leave. Not visibly. She turned to Elijah, an idea forming. You mentioned a delivery sled. Could it conceal a passenger? Elijah considered this, stroking his beard. Possibly. I have deliveries scheduled in Silver Creek tomorrow, ironwork for the new saloon. I could construct a hidden compartment beneath the goods, and their watcher would see only the blacksmith making his regular delivery run, Catherine added, excitement building. I could remain hidden until we're well beyond his view. It's risky, Elijah cautioned. The trail is rough. You'd be jostled considerably. I've endured worse these past days, she replied with determination, and we have no alternative if I'm to reach Silver Creek without raising suspicions. Elijah nodded slowly, conviction replacing doubt. I'll need to modify the sled. It will take several hours. I'll help, Catherine offered, already moving toward the stable area. The sooner we begin, the better. They worked through the day, speaking little but moving in coordinated efficiency. Elijah constructed a false bottom in his delivery sled, a space just large enough for Catherine to lie flat, concealed beneath his ironwork deliveries but with small air holes disguised within the wooden construction. Catherine gathered provisions, repacked her satchel to its smallest possible configuration, and prepared herself for the uncomfortable journey ahead. By late afternoon, their preparations were complete. The watcher remained on the ridge, vigilant even as daylight began to fade. We'll leave before dawn, Elijah said as they shared a simple dinner. The darkness will provide additional cover, and we should reach Silver Creek by midday. Catherine nodded, suddenly aware that their time together was rapidly drawing to a close. Once they reached Silver Creek, their paths would necessarily diverge, she to deliver the deed and gather intelligence, he to maintain his cover as the simple blacksmith with no connection to Hayes Enterprises. Will you be safe, she asked. After Henderson's suspicions, I have survived 15 years in these mountains, Elijah reminded. I can handle one overzealous security man. But both knew the stakes had changed. If her father suspected any conspiracy, Elijah would be an obvious target for investigation, a solitary man with few connections. wisely eliminated if deemed a threat. As night fell, they sat before the forge fire, shoulders nearly touching, the warmth between them having little to do with the flames. Catherine's hand found his, fingers interlacing with a familiarity that belied their brief acquaintance. "When this is over," she began, then stopped. Uncertain how to articulate the future, she suddenly found herself imagining one that somehow included this quiet, principled man whose life had been shattered by her father. "When this is over," Elijah continued for her, his voice low and intimate in the firelit workshop, "we will find each other again, under better circumstances." Catherine turned to face him, memorizing his features in the golden light, the strength in his jawline, the intelligence in his eyes, the surprising gentleness in his expression as he looked at her. "I will hold you to that promise, Elijah Morgan," she whispered, leaning forward to seal the words with a kiss as tender as their first had been urgent. Outside, the watcher remained, unaware that within the forge plans had been laid that would ultimately challenge the very empire. Jeremiah Hayes had built plans born in a blizzard's enforced intimacy, now forged as strong as the metal shaped by Elijah's skilled hands. Darkness still shrouded the mountains when Elijah roused Catherine from a fitful sleep. Outside, fresh snow had fallen during the night. Perfect for their purpose, it would cover their tracks and muffle the sound of the sled runners. The watcher remained on the ridge, huddled against the cold, his attention clearly waning after hours of surveillance. "It's time," Elijah whispered, helping Catherine into her coat. The hidden compartment in the sled felt even smaller than it had appeared during construction. Catherine slid into the narrow space, her satchel clutched to her chest, the deed within it pressing against her like a physical manifestation of her moral burden. Elijah checked the air holes one final time, then met her eyes. "The journey will be uncomfortable," he cautioned, "but we'll stop once we're out of sight of the ridge." Catherine nodded, steeling herself. "I'm ready." With one last lingering look, Elijah closed the false bottom, securing it with disguised latches. Darkness enveloped Catherine completely. The only sound, her own shallow breathing and the muffled movements of Elijah loading ironwork above her, the weight pressed down, not painfully but with a constant presence, like the choices that had brought her to this moment. The sled jerked into motion. Through small gaps in the wood, Catherine caught glimpses of lightning sky as dawn gradually broke over the mountain range. The constant motion, combined with the cramped space, soon made her muscles ache in protest. She focused on breathing steadily, on the silver medallion pressed against her skin, on the memory of Elijah's kiss, anything to distract from the discomfort. Time became abstract, measured only by the changing light through the tiny holes and the varying rhythm of the sled's movement. Sometimes they moved swiftly across flat terrain. Other times they jolted and jerked down steeper sections, forcing Catherine to brace herself against the sides of her hiding place. True to his word, Elijah stopped once they were well beyond the watcher's view. The top opened and blessed fresh air rushed in as Catherine gratefully accepted his hand to help her emerge. "We're about 5 miles from the forge," he informed her, offering water from a canteen. No sign of anyone following. Catherine stretched her cramped limbs, savoring the momentary freedom. "How much farther to Silver Creek?" "Another 15 miles. Elijah checked the position of the sun. "We should arrive by early afternoon if we maintain this pace." All too soon, she had to return to her hiding place, the brief respite making the confinement seem even more restrictive. Above her, she could hear Elijah occasionally speaking to the horse, his voice a reassuring constant through the long hours that followed. They stopped twice more before the sounds around them changed noticeably, the hollow echo of the mountain trails giving way to the more substantial noises of civilization. Wagon wheels on packed earth, voices calling greeting, dogs barking. They had reached Silver Creek. The sled came to a final stop. Through the air holes, Catherine could smell wood smoke and cooking, hear the bustle of a town in full daytime activity. Elijah's voice came, pitched for her ears alone. "We're behind the Silver Peak Hotel. I'll unload the ironwork at the saloon first, then return. Wait for my signal." Time crawled as Catherine lay in darkness. The sounds of the busy town tantalizingly close, yet separated from her by mere inches of wood. Finally, after what seemed hours, she heard Elijah's footsteps returning. "It's clear," he murmured, unlatching the compartment. "Quickly now." Catherine emerged into a narrow alley behind the hotel, her legs nearly buckling after so many hours confined. Elijah steadied her with a hand at her elbow, his expression a careful mask as they stood in public for the first time. "The hotel owner believes you're my cousin from Denver," he explained in a low voice. "Arrived by private conveyance due to the stagecoach accident. I've secured you a room under the name Catherine Morgan." The shared surname sent an unexpected warmth through her, though she knew it was merely a practical cover. "And Henderson's men?" "At the sheriff's office, organizing search parties." Elijah handed her a small key. "Room 204, top of the stairs. The Hayes representative man named Caldwell is staying here as well." "He's the one you're meant to deliver the deed to," Catherine nodded, suddenly reluctant to part from Elijah despite the necessity. "When will I see you again?" "I'll finish my deliveries, then return to the forge tonight." His voice remained neutral, though his eyes conveyed deeper emotions. "The medallion if you need me. And if all goes well," a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then we proceed as planned. You gather information, boss, and I maintain our communication channel here." It sounded so clinical, so devoid of the connection that had grown between them during those storm-bound days. Catherine found herself reaching for his hand, propriety forgotten as their fingers interlaced briefly. "Be careful," she whispered. "And you." He released her hand reluctantly. "Your father's men are not to be underestimated." With that warning, he turned back to his sled, resuming his role as the simple blacksmith making his rounds. Catherine watched him for a moment before slipping into the hotel's side entrance, the weight of her satchel and the deed within it a constant reminder of her purpose. The hotel room was modest but clean, with a small window overlooking the town's main street. Catherine had just enough time to wash away the journey's dust before a knock came at her door. Heart racing, she opened it to find a thin man in an expensive suit, his expression shifting from official politeness to shock. "Miss Hayes. We'd feared the worst after the coach accident, Mr. Caldwell, I presume." Catherine maintained her composure, falling back on years of social training. "As you can see, I'm quite well. Your father will be enormously relieved. Sent telegrams daily since the accident was discovered." He glanced past her into the room. "How did you manage to reach Silver Creek?" "Henderson has been searching the mountains for days. Fortune smiled upon me," Catherine replied carefully. "A local man found me and offered shelter during the storm. He delivered me here today." Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "Henderson mentioned a blacksmith who denied seeing any traveler, did he?" Catherine's expression revealed nothing. "Perhaps there are multiple blacksmiths in the region." In any case, she reached into her satchel, withdrawing the sealed document. "I believe this is what you've been waiting for." The deed changed hands, Caldwell's fingers closing around it with obvious satisfaction. "Indeed. With this, Hayes Enterprises secures its position in Silver Creek. Your father will be most pleased with your perseverance." "Miss Hayes? I'm sure he will," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the conflict raging within her. The deed was delivered, her cover maintained, her deeper purpose still concealed. Phase 1 complete. Over the next 2 days, Catherine played her role perfectly. She sent a telegram to her father confirming her safe arrival and successful delivery of the deed. She accepted the solicitous attention of Caldwell and Henderson, providing a carefully edited account of her ordeal that mentioned neither Elijah's name nor the true location of his forge. And most importantly, she listened at dinner in the hotel lobby. During business meetings where she was invited as a courtesy to Jeremiah Hayes' daughter, she learned of Clayton Pacific's local representative, a forthright woman named Abigail Whitmore, who had established genuine relationships with the townspeople rather than merely buying their compliance. She discovered which judge oversaw land disputes in the territory an aging but reportedly incorruptible former military officer with no ties to Eastern money. She identified potential allies and obstacles, meticulously cataloging each piece of information for future use. On her third night in Silver Creek, as preparations were being made for her return journey to Boston, Catherine slipped away from the hotel. Wrapped in a plain cloak borrowed from a sympathetic hotel maid, she made her way to the edge of town where a familiar figure waited beside a tethered horse. "You shouldn't have come," Elijah said softly as she approached. "Too dangerous." "I needed to see you," Catherine replied simply, "to be certain of our path forward." In the moonlight, his features were cast in silver and shadow, reminiscent of their first days together in the forge. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "The deed?" he asked. "Delivered as planned. My father's trust is secure." Catherine moved closer, lowering her voice though they were alone on the darkened trail. "But I've learned much about Clayton Pacific's representative, a woman of surprising integrity, and the territorial judge appears genuinely independent." Elijah nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Good. You've laid groundwork for what comes next. And you? Will you be safe after I leave?" "Henderson's men concluded their search yesterday. They're escorting you to Denver tomorrow, I hear." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I'll return to my forge, resume my quiet existence." No one the wiser about Elijah Morgan's connection to Catherine Hayes. She stepped closer still, close enough to feel the heat radiating from him despite the night's chill. "Until justice is done." "Until justice is done," he agreed, drawing her into his arms with a tenderness that belied his strength. Their kiss held both promise and farewell, and to their storm-bound beginning, yet a pledge of what awaited beyond their separate journeys toward a common goal. When they parted, Catherine touched the silver medallion beneath her dress, a tangible reminder of their bond. "Remember," Elijah murmured, "you're not alone in this fight anymore." As Catherine returned to the hotel, the weight of her mission balanced by the unexpected gift of his alliance, she reflected on the strange workings of fate. She had arrived at Elijah Morgan's forge as Jeremiah Hayes' loyal daughter, carrying a document meant to extend her father's corrupt empire. She departed as her own woman, committed to a cause larger than family loyalty, strengthened by an unexpected love born in the crucible of truth and adversity. Behind her, Elijah watched until she disappeared into the town's shadows. Then he turned back toward the mountains, toward his solitary forge where he had once sought only to escape his past. Now as he urged his horse homeward, that same forge represented not an end but a beginning, a place where justice, long delayed, had finally found its champion in the most unlikely of allies. Above them both, the stars wheeled in the clear mountain sky, witnesses to the unlikely bond forged between them, a bond as strong and true as the finest metal shaped by fire, hammer, and unwavering purpose.